I simply cannot find her.
Maria?
She's missing from the Abbey again.
Perhaps we should have put a cowbell around her neck.
I have looked everywhere, in all of the usual places.
Considering that it's Maria, I suggest you look in some place.
And the entire crew is doubled over, biting their fists, trying not to laugh out loud. That's not a rumor. That's not fan fiction. That's what actually happened behind the scenes of one of the most beloved films ever made. And for decades, the studio made sure almost nobody found out. This is the real story of the secrets, near disasters, and quietly buried scandals, hidden underneath the gentle hills of The Sound of Music. Long before Julie Andrews ever twirled through an alpine meadow, the story of the Von Trapp family had already conquered an entire continent. Just not in English. In the mid-1950s, a German filmmaker named Wolfgang Liebeneiner adapted Maria von Trapp's memoir into 2 low-budget films. They were sentimental, a little clunky, and dripping with old-fashioned European charm. But audiences in West Germany couldn't get enough. The films became the country's biggest commercial hit of the era, and the story spread across Europe and into South America, resonating with people who had just lived through a devastating war and desperately wanted a tale about love triumphing over fear. When American studio executives finally sat down to watch these films, they were unimpressed. To them, it looked like an overly earnest community theater production. Charming maybe, but nowhere near sophisticated enough for Hollywood. Nobody wanted to touch it. Then, a Tony-winning director named Vincent J. Donahue, sent by Paramount to scout for new material, watched the German films and saw something everyone else had missed. Underneath the clumsy production values was a story with real emotional weight. He made a suggestion that nobody expected. Forget film entirely. Turn this into a Broadway musical and build it around Mary Martin. That single idea would eventually snowball into a cultural phenomenon. But first, there was the matter of a woman who had almost given away the rights to her own life story for pocket change. Maria von Trapp wasn't a savvy negotiator. She had no agent, no legal team, no real understanding of what her family story might be worth someday. When German producers approached her in the early 1950s wanting to buy the rights to her memoir, she agreed to a single flat payment of roughly $9,000, around $100,000 today. It was enough to help her family get by, but it was a fraction of what the story would eventually generate. She had also, without fully realizing it, signed away far more control than she intended. Later, when Hollywood tried to sidestep the situation entirely by buying just the title of her book and building a loosely inspired story around it, Maria refused. If her family story was going to reach the world, she insisted it be told honestly, not chopped up for convenience. By the late 1950s, Broadway royalty Mary Martin and her husband, producer Richard Halliday, were determined to bring the story to the stage. But there was one problem. Nobody could find Maria. She was in the jungles of Papua New Guinea doing missionary work with Father Franz Wasner, the family's former music director, completely disconnected from the outside world. Letters piled up at remote mission posts, and Maria, uninterested in show business, tore many of them up without even opening them. It was only when Maria and Father Wasner sailed back into San Francisco that fate stepped in. Richard Halliday was waiting at the dock and handed her 2 tickets to see his wife perform in Annie, Get Your Gun. Maria went, likely out of politeness, and left the theater stunned by Mary Martin's talent. She had to break the news that she'd already sold the film rights to the Germans years earlier, but she gave the Broadway team her blessing to try anyway. That one small, almost offhand permission would change entertainment history. The original plan for the stage musical was modest. Blend a handful of new songs with traditional Austrian folk tunes the real Trapp family used to perform. Then producers approached Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein about writing just a couple of songs, and the legendary duo flatly refused to do it that way. Either they wrote the entire score or they walked. It was all or nothing. That ultimatum reshaped the entire project. Rodgers and Hammerstein were tied up finishing Flower Drum Song, so the show was shelved for a while. When they finally returned to it, they rebuilt it from the ground up with a fully original score. My favorite things: Do-Re-Mi, Edelweiss, Climb Every Mountain. Songs that are still instantly recognizable more than 60 years later. The Sound of Music opened on Broadway on November 16, 1959 at the Lunt-Fontanne Theater, starring Mary Martin and Theodore Bikel. It cost roughly $400,000 to mount, and the returns were staggering. Advance ticket sales alone eventually topped $232 million. Mary Martin missed only a single performance during the show's entire run of over 1,400 performances, which stretched nearly 4 years before finally closing in mid-1963. By 1960, movie studios were circling. 20th Century Fox won the bidding war, paying $1.25 million for the film rights, more than $13 million in today's money. It was a bold bet for a studio still bleeding cash after the infamous overspending disaster of Cleopatra. Buried in the contract was a clause that would later look almost comical in hindsight. If the film earned more than $12.5 million, Rodgers and Hammerstein's estate would collect 10% of the profits. Co-writer Howard Lindsay reportedly laughed at the clause, convinced the film would never come close to that number. He could not have been more wrong. Before she was ever cast as Maria, Julie Andrews had already conquered Broadway as Eliza Doolittle in My Fair Lady. When Hollywood adapted that musical into a film, studio executives decided Andrews wasn't camera-ready, code for not glamorous enough by their standards, and gave the role to Audrey Hepburn instead, whose singing voice ultimately had to be dubbed for most of the film. It was a devastating professional snub. But not long after, director Robert Wise was searching for someone to play Maria Von Trapp and wasn't sure Andrews was the right fit, until an early, unfinished cut of Mary Poppins landed in front of him. Just a few minutes in, he reportedly turned to his screenwriter and said they needed to lock her down before another studio did. Andrews signed on for a flat fee of $225,000, about $2.28 million today, with no royalties, no bonuses, and no back-end profit share whatsoever. Once she cashed that check, her financial relationship with the film was over. Compare that to Mary Martin, who had negotiated a Broadway deal that eventually paid her more than $8 million from the stage production's profits. Fox simply didn't believe Andrews was a big enough name yet to deserve that kind of arrangement. That decision aged badly. Mary Poppins became a massive hit, and Andrews won the Academy Award for Best Actress. In one of the more quietly savage moments in Oscar history, she thanked Jack Warner, the very executive who had rejected her for My Fair Lady, during her acceptance speech. The Sound of Music would go on to become her defining role, earning hundreds of millions of dollars worldwide, and she never received a cent beyond that original flat fee. Casting Captain George Von Trapp turned into its own headache. Robert Wise approached a long list of leading men: Sean Connery, fresh off becoming James Bond; Richard Burton, known for his intensity both on screen and in his turbulent personal life. Even Bing Crosby was floated as a possibility. None of them felt right for the role. Christopher Plummer eventually took the part, but reluctantly. He thought the material was saccharine, privately nicknaming it the sound of mucus, and turned the role down multiple times. Wise flew to London to convince him personally, and Plummer finally agreed, but only if he could help reshape the character, giving the captain more emotional depth and better dialogue. He specifically requested a song of his own to reveal a softer, more vulnerable side. That request is the reason Edelweiss exists in the film at all. Contrary to popular belief, it isn't a traditional Austrian folk song. Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote it specifically for Plummer's character. Even after those changes, Plummer struggled with the role throughout filming, later admitting he drank during parts of the production, including during one of the film's most emotionally charged scenes. Despite his private resentment toward the project, his performance carried real weight. The quiet transformation from a rigid, grief-hardened father into someone capable of love again became one of the film's emotional anchors. And like Andrews, Plummer had signed a flat contract with no royalties. As the film eventually grossed over $286 million globally, both of its lead stars watched from the sidelines with nothing but their original paychecks. One of the film's most emotional beats is the moment Captain Von Trapp sings Edelweiss at the music festival, visibly fighting back tears. It's often held up as the clearest proof of his character's transformation. What audiences didn't know for years is that Plummer has since admitted he was significantly intoxicated while filming that very scene. In his 2008 memoir, he described himself bluntly as an arrogant young actor with little genuine emotional connection to the material at the time, and yet the performance moved millions of viewers regardless. It remains one of the strangest bits of behind-the-scenes trivia in the film's history. One of its most tender, sincere-looking moments was captured almost by accident. Plummer also carried a separate, more embarrassing secret. During the film's musical numbers, much of his singing was not actually his own voice. A professional vocalist named Bill Lee, who had also provided singing voices for Disney's Sleeping Beauty and Mary Poppins, recorded the sustained singing sections, while Plummer's own voice was kept mainly for spoken dialogue and short transitions. Plummer reportedly resented the decision, feeling it undercut his performance, but producers weren't willing to gamble on his vocal range for such a high-stakes production. The dub was seamless enough that most audiences still assume they're hearing Plummer sing to this day. Now for the story the studio worked hardest to keep quiet: the gazebo scene. It's remembered as one of the most romantic moments in film history. Soft lighting, a quiet melody, Maria and the captain finally admitting their feelings for each other. What audiences never saw was just how many takes it took to get there, or why. To simulate moonlight, the crew relied on massive carbon arc lamps, industrial-grade lighting equipment that ran extremely hot and extremely loud. And the specific sound those lamps produced every single time they powered on was an unmistakably crude, flatulent, buzzing noise. Every time Christopher Plummer leaned in to kiss Julie Andrews, the lamps would let out that same ridiculous sound, and the two actors would completely fall apart laughing. According to Andrews, they attempted the scene roughly 20 times, and even the film's most serious romantic dialogue kept collapsing into fits of giggles from the entire crew. Eventually, director Robert Wise abandoned the original lighting setup altogether. Instead of shooting the couple head-on under those noisy lamps, he repositioned them in front of the gazebo's glowing windows and filmed the moment largely in silhouette, hiding their faces and their laughter from the camera. The result is often praised as one of the most visually romantic choices in the film. In reality, it was pure damage control, born out of a scene that simply refused to be filmed straight. 20th Century Fox reportedly instructed cast and crew not to discuss the failed takes publicly, and for years, most fans assumed the scene had been shot without a hitch. The truth only became public decades later, when Julie Andrews finally described the ordeal on television, recalling how difficult it was to play an intimate love scene while absurd noises kept interrupting from below. Filming wasn't only awkward, at times it was genuinely dangerous. During the boat scene, where the Von Trapp children famously tip into the lake, 5-year-old Kim Carruth, who played the youngest daughter, Gretel, very nearly drowned. Just before filming, the crew informed Julie Andrews that Kim couldn't swim, and the plan was for Andrews to fall toward the child the moment the boat capsized, so she could grab her immediately. Instead, when the boat flipped, Andrews ended up falling backward, away from Gretel rather than toward her. Kim slipped beneath the surface twice before another cast member dove in and pulled her to safety. She came up coughing and vomiting lake water, and reportedly developed a fear of swimming that lingered for years afterward. Andrews later called it one of the most frightening moments of the entire production. Even the film's cheerful opening shot, Maria spinning joyfully through a mountain meadow as the camera soars overhead, hit its own physical toll. Capturing that sweeping aerial view required a helicopter to fly roughly 20 feet above Andrews. Every time it circled back for another pass, the force of the rotor wash slammed her flat into the grass. She was knocked down repeatedly, by some accounts 6 or 7 times, and had to get back up, brush herself off, and reset her expression as though nothing had happened, take after take. She later joked that she nearly ended up airborne herself. What looks effortless and dreamlike on screen was, in reality, closer to being repeatedly tackled by a low-flying aircraft. Salzburg looked like the perfect filming location on paper: rolling hills, storybook architecture, dramatic mountain backdrops. What the crew didn't anticipate was the weather. 1964 turned out to be one of the wettest years on record in the region, and constant rain delays wrecked the production schedule. What was supposed to be a 6-week location shoot stretched to 11 weeks, with more than 250 cast and crew members sitting idle in soaked clothing while costs quietly piled up. Hotel bills, equipment repairs, extended wages, and general overhead pushed the production's original $8.2 million budget higher and higher. Given that Fox was already reeling financially from the Cleopatra fiasco, there was genuine anxiety inside the studio that this seemingly wholesome family musical might become the thing that finally sank the company. One studio insider reportedly worried aloud that the film could be the end of them. Before Robert Wise ever came aboard, acclaimed director William Wyler was originally attached to lead the project, so committed to it, in fact, that he stepped down from his position on Fox's board early in 1963 to avoid any conflict of interest. But privately, Wyler had reservations from the start. He wasn't emotionally connected to the stage musical, and after flying to New York to see the Broadway production in person, he came away unconvinced that the songs fit naturally into the story. He was also quietly losing his hearing, which made the prospect of directing a music-driven film even more daunting. Wyler began looking for a graceful exit and found one when producers offered him The Collector, a much darker psychological thriller that suited his sensibilities far better. He asked studio leadership to release him from his commitment, and the official explanation given to the press was simply scheduling conflicts. The real reason was that he had lost faith in the project entirely. His departure opened the door for Robert Wise to step in during late 1963 and shape the film into the version audiences would eventually fall in love with. When The Sound of Music hit theaters in 1965, nobody anticipated just how far it would go. Within about 18 months, it had done something almost unthinkable. It dethroned Gone with the Wind as the highest-grossing film of all time, a record that had stood since 1939. It ultimately pulled in roughly $286 million worldwide, all based on 1960s ticket prices, translating to an estimated 283 million tickets sold globally, close to one in every 12 people alive at the time. It swept the Academy Awards, winning 5 Oscars including Best Picture and Best Director, and became a genuine cultural touchstone that crossed language barriers, sung and hummed in places that had never even seen a marketing campaign for it. But behind every glowing frame of that phenomenon were the things audiences were never meant to see. A leading actress repeatedly knocked flat by a helicopter, a leading man secretly dubbed and quietly drunk through one of his most iconic scenes, a 5-year-old nearly drowning during a fun family scene, a romantic kiss ruined over and over by industrial lighting equipment that sounded like a bodily function, and a studio doing everything it could to keep all of it buried. Decades later, once the contracts had expired and the people involved no longer had